Myths and misunderstandings can come about in various ways in a game like Final Fantasy XIV. How exactly they come about can range from something that used to work one way being changed and not realizing it was changed, to the game poorly explaining or showing what it does, to things that are so specific that, well, whether it is true or not doesn't matter that much, so you didn't check. I want to go over a bunch of these kinds of claims, myths and odd interactions and explain how they work, how they are false, or if they even are false in the first place. And if you know of some strange game interaction you would like tested or explained, be sure to share them in the comments. Now, let's get myth busting. Number 1. Don't put HOTS on your tank while they pull, you'll steal aggro from them. What? Before Shadowbringers, over 6 years ago by the way, tanks generated way less enmity than they do now. To be specific, in Stormblood, a tank in a tank stance would generate 3 times more enmity than if they were not in a tank stance. At the same time, the tank stance typically reduced their damage output by about 20%, making the enmity increase closer to 2.4 times as much. By Shadowbringers, tanks had to deal with the passive, unexplained 20% less damage output tanks just have per potency, but also their tank stances now generated 10 times more enmity. They still do. This meant that tanks now generated enough enmity that one AoE swing often was enough for DPS and healers to safely act a bit while mobs were being rounded up, leading to the way most of us deal with AoE pulls nowadays. But before Shadowbringers, because a tank's AoE attack generated a rather pathetic amount of enmity, you typically had to hold your fire until the tank reached their destination and started AoEing if you didn't want to risk getting aggro yourself. A prominent example of this was the fact that applying regen to the tank had a tendency to steal aggro from tanks that only did one AoE attack on the mobs, if even that. So many tanks swore by the strategy that healers had to simply do nothing until the destination was reached. However, by Shadowbringers, the only way for regen to steal aggro off a mob that was on the tank was if the application or heal tick happened before the tank had a chance to hit something, or if the tank never hit it in the first place, or if the healer, in addition to regen, was also actively attacking that specific mob. Why is this? The way healing enmity works is that whenever healing is produced, the number is divided by 2, sometimes it varies, and then whatever remains is equally distributed on all enemies. This means that if regen heals for, say, 1500 potency in total, it amounts to 750 potencies worth of enmity. And if you are fighting one thing, then it's 750 potency on just that. But if you're already in combat with 3 things, it is actually only 250 potency per thing. Meanwhile, a tank using their AoE filler would generate over 800 potencies worth of enmity, when considering the built-in 20% less damage per potency, immediately, compared to regen's over time effect. What this means is that a white mage, for example, using regen on the tank would only be capable of pulling aggro off the tank on mobs the tank has yet to hit or never hit in the first place, and by extension, mobs that the DPS never hit either. This myth becomes even funnier when we count in the 6.2 Endwalker change that made healing over time no longer generate enmity. What this means is that the application of a healing over time effect, such as regen, generates a negligible amount of enmity, also known as buff enmity. This is effectively so little that all it does is make sure you enter combat with things when you support a player. This also means that once the buff enmity from regen is applied, it generates 0 enmity for the remainder of its duration. The only way for regen to steal aggro from a tank is if regen is applied while the tank is already in combat and the buff enmity happens to hit an enemy that no one else has attacked yet. An interesting extra detail to this is that the 6.2 change making HOTS no longer generate enmity also made it so EOS and Cardia no longer generates enmity, but I don't see any tanks complaining about that. At least, Certainly not anymore, because ultimately the problem now comes down to a small bit of buff enmity that is easily overcome by either the healer applying their buff before the tank enters combat, or by the tank hitting everything, which sometimes can require that they lean back a step to catch them before they pass the tank when these things happen. A rather hilarious countermeasure tanks can use if they do have issues with the healer stealing aggro with buff enmity is to simply toggle their tank stance off and on again. It generates 10 times more buff enmity than the regen application does because it affects itself. If you want to test this yourself, grab a friend, be in a party, find a striking dummy, and each enter combat with a dummy with a weak attack. Then simply repeatedly toggle your tank stance on and off and notice that you generate enmity each time. An even funnier trick to this is that a ninja generates a small amount of enmity for each mudra sign they make. Number 2. Tempera Grassa only generates its cooldown reduction if all the shields break. False. Tempera Grassa, the area of effect version of Pictomancer's barrier, generates a shield for 10% of max HP for itself and quote-unquote nearby party members. I don't know if I would count 30 yoms as nearby, but you do you, Squeenix. The cooldown of Tempera Coat, and so Grassa, is reduced by 30 seconds if quote barrier is completely absorbed, unquote. This description is rather vague and is somewhat open for interpretation. Completely absorbed, you say? Does that mean all the barriers, a barrier, or a specific one? To test this, you will need one friend, in my case, Nox here. And one of you must be a Pictomancer, obviously. Find enemies that are capable of dealing 10% of each of you's max HP and damage in under 10 seconds. For our first test, have each of you engage combat with a mob so you're both taking damage, and then activate Tempera Grassa. Observe that the cooldown of Tempera Coat jumps by 30 seconds the moment the last barrier is fully spent. However, observe also that the last barrier was mine. For the second test, just have the Pictomancer fight something, and let the other players safely stand nearby to receive Tempera Grassa. Use it, and observe that the cooldown of Tempera Coat jumps when the Pictomancer's, my, shield is broken. In other words, the cooldown reduction is granted once your own shield is broken. The only other barrier jobs have access to with a similar payoff-like effect is Sage's Evocation Prognosis, where you gain an adder sting when your own shield breaks on you. The difference here in explanation, why we don't need to test that, is that the tooltip for adder stings specifies that it is when the Evocation Prognosis on yourself breaks that you get the adder sting. A little side bonus that we did not record, but briefly tested, is that Tempera Grassa's barrier has a higher priority than TBN, meaning that if a Dark Knight uses TBN while a Pictomancer uses Tempera Grassa, the HP of the Tempera Grassa shield will be spent first, much to the Dark Knight's annoyance. Number 3. While the AoE limit breaks in a dungeon will deal more total damage, it doesn't matter if the melee limit break saves more time. Technically true. Let's discuss. In a previous Mythbuster episode, I discussed the comparison between ranged and mage limit break, and sort of quietly assumed it was a given that we would be using the AoE limit breaks over the melee limit breaks, without fairly comparing them all against each other. The argument presented was, if you use an AoE limit break before the final boss, you probably also get a melee LB1 on the boss anyway. And often, LB2 is just not happening on the final boss. However, 2 counterpoints have been presented to me since then. The first one is that in some groups, or in some dungeons more precisely, the first limit break 1 is obtained during the second boss fight. If you use it on the boss, you probably will not have an AoE limit break for the mobs leading to the final boss. But you most certainly will have a limit break 1 for the final boss, and possibly an LB2, who knows? The second one is the observation that, indeed, the fact a ranged or mage LB on a large blob of enemies will do more damage than a melee LB on a single target, what really matters is how much time is saved. If using the AoE LB saves 5 seconds of combat, but the melee LB saves 10 somehow, then it doesn't matter that the AoE limit break did more damage. Similarly, if the melee LB saves 5 seconds, while the AoE saves 10, then that is what matters. So, how do we actually measure that? How would we measure which limit break saves more time? Well, one way could be to simply run a dungeon twice, one time using the limit break one way, the other way. However, due to the sheer amount of variance in any two runs due to what crits, sometimes exactly how a mechanic plays out, and so on, 2 runs would certainly not be enough to get clear evidence. Another factor is also that some jobs perform better on AoE packs than others. Sometimes simply how cooldowns align with a pull can make one or the other option better, and this can be directly influenced by how good gear the team has or how well the players play, meaning that not only could the answer of whether a melee LB or an AoE LB saves more time through simply testing be influenced by how well the testers themselves perform, the answer would likely rely on this information. Another way you could try and approach this in a more systematic way would be to try and calculate, say, the average potency per second on single target of a given job, and then calculate how that changes for 2 targets, 3 targets, 4 targets, and so on. The logic being that if we knew how much damage a job does on AoE relative to their single target, then we could much more easily determine whether more damage on one target, melee LB, is superior to less damage on many targets, ranged or mage LB. However, the reality of this situation is that each job has a slightly different AoE scaling from the rest, and more importantly, for a lot of jobs, they scale differently with target count with different attacks. So we would probably not find a perfect single number to represent how much damage a job does on AoE relative to their single target, as they might gradually drop as more targets are introduced. If their damage heavily relies on main target attack with damage drop-off, then that means the higher damage on the main target would be less valuable the more targets there are. So we would have a different answer for every target count. And even if we could find a satisfying number this way, this number would represent a general average of a job's performance, which, to be sure it would actually be realistically accurate, would require the fight to last long enough that all cooldowns are used at least one full cycle. So a 2-minute fight, if not 3 minutes for some jobs with weird cooldowns, would probably be necessary to get a reliable result. And I don't know about you, but most of my AoE pulls swing around 30 seconds, give or take. And this is very important. The most important factor in getting maximum value out of a DPS limit break in any situation is to make sure you use the limit break during your filler and not during burst, and to make sure you don't do any overkill damage. We sort of covered this first one on the melee LB one in a previous episode too. Now, in a solid dungeon party, you would see the 2-minute cooldowns be used on the first AoE pull, then a mix of whatever's left over and 1-minute cooldowns are used on the second pull. Then the 2-minute burst comes back sometime early on in the first boss fight, and the boss will die typically before the 4-minute burst, meaning that carries over to the third pull. The fourth pull relies on the 1-minute cooldowns once again, and the 6-minute burst comes up at some point during the second boss. The 8-minute burst then tends to come up for the 5th pull, and so on the 6th pull you rely on 1-minute cooldowns again. So the final boss can lead with a 10-minute burst and sometimes also have the 12-minute burst. For pretty much any AoE pull where the 2-minute burst features, there is no point in using a limit break, as the pack will be dead or near dead by the time the burst finishes. This often explains why the 5th pull does not feature a limit break unless the second boss dragged out somewhat. Depending on the group, LB1 can become available somewhere around halfway through to near the end of the second boss, and if the boss happens to have a mechanic ongoing so you can't just stop and LB it, then by the time you can, the boss might be near death and there's no point. Because of all these moving parts, here is my advice on how to make use of your limit breaks in a dungeon context. If you have access to limit break 1 during a mid-boss fight, and you have a melee DPS, and they are currently performing their filler rotation, and using limit break will not affect them in a negative way, then use melee limit break 1 on the boss. If you are in this situation but do not have a melee DPS, then I recommend saving the limit break. If you have access to limit break 1 during an AoE pull and you have a ranged or mage DPS and they are currently performing their filler rotation, then use limit break 1. Prefer a mage limit break if you can choose. For the final dungeon boss, the advice for melee limit break still applies. However, before sending the melee limit break, consider whether a limit break 2 will become available early enough that all of the damage will connect to the boss, and importantly, will your melee DPS not be bursting in time for that? This kind of also applies to an AoE limit break, as these are also typically better than not using them on the final boss. In fact, the consideration that you deal no or as little overkill damage as possible with the limit break is important for the mid-boss, and AoE pulls as well. If we roughly assume that a limit break 1 used in its optimal conditions saves a similar amount of time, then what really matters in the end is how many you get to do. So if you can have a melee LB1 on the second boss during filler, do it. If you can have an AoE LB1 on an AoE pull during filler, do that, and so on. A funny little aside is that speedruns of the current level 100 dungeons of course feature 1 tank, 3 DPS, but also go so fast that they tend to get their first limit break during like the tail end of the final boss fight, except in Alexandria, where might come up in time for a mage LB instead, which is what the logs show they end up using in that specific and exclusive case instead. Number 4, featuring a callback to the episode Covering Cover. If you cover a knockback, but your cover target is getting pushed in a different direction than you, what happens? This is tested with the same setup as previously, with Nox here helping me. The first boss in Malika's Well performs a predictable, reliable, circular knockback about once a minute. Place the knockback in the center of the arena, have the paladin stand on one side and the covered player on the other side, and use cover. The result? The paladin is shoved twice as hard away from the knockback center point, as if both attacks targeted the paladin originally. For an additional test, same setup, but make sure the paladin is far enough away from the knockback that only the cover player is hit. The paladin is still knocked away from the knockback center point, suggesting the attack is resolved as if it hit the paladin originally. If an attack targeting the covered player pushes in a specified direction, then the paladin would obviously be pushed in that direction, because the position of the paladin, nor the cover target, doesn't matter in that case. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you happen to come across or have a myth or claim or even just something interesting you would like explained or tested. I do keep a list of these, so just because I didn't cover yours yet doesn't necessarily mean I skipped it, although, you know, you can always repeat it. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, apparently before Stormblood, cover didn't affect magic, and so only physical actions. Additionally, supposedly before Shadowbringers, cover didn't strike through hallowed ground, and this was apparently used in certain boss fights as part of a strategy. There was also an extended period where cover reduced the damage the paladin took by 20% as they received it from the cover target.